Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm once again joined by Florian. Glad to have you back.
Glad to be back.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And don't forget to follow the channel on Locals, Telegram, and Facebook and X. And you can support the channel Locals, subscribe, star, and buy me a coffee. Today's episode is number 18 of Political Commentary, the first of this year. And this was in part a recommendation from Florian, the U.S. military Mirage reality. This sounded like a really good choice right after our video with Venezuela, where we all sort of commented on elements that looked sus. And so let's just start by framing this. So, as I mentioned in the roundtable on Venezuela, when the United States loses a protracted military conflict, like Vietnam, it goes and beats up on Latin American countries to look strong, to sort of restore faith in the institution. So you have in the 70s and 80s, Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, and then ultimately Desert Storm in the early 90s. Then, of course, there's the GWAT. The U.S. loses. Taliban is still in charge. And they also dump resources into Ukraine, which looks like it's going sideways for the U.S. So they have to do it again. They have to go back to Latin America, get some easy wins, and then probably rinse and repeat. So, yeah, not great. So then what is the actual... See, this is the thing with any military, but especially a hegemonic military like the U.S. The goal is to have a present or show an image of strength, even if it's not true. That's part of the problem and the difficulty of unpacking all of this. Is it, of course, the U.S. military is going to exude strength as long as it can. The question then is that just smoke and mirrors, or is that reality? So I'll start with a kind of middle of the road take. Let's go back to 2001. The grand strategy of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden was to bog down the United States and the Middle East and deplete its resources. Well, even though Osama bin Laden is no longer with us, mission accomplished. The U.S. capability of projecting power is greatly reduced after 20 years. And how do we know this? Well, I mean, we know the U.S. doesn't go kicking down the door like it did in 2003. It just can't do that anymore. The troops that, Trump has mustered near Venezuela might be used on an invasion in the future, but that's still an open question. And then furthermore, U.S. is relying heavily on allies in Europe to fight Russia and allies in the Pacific. Though, of course, it is putting more of its pieces in the Pacific to counter China. So I think after the global war on terror, and even after the 3 years thus far of war in Ukraine, or almost 4 years now, we have a significant depletion in U.S. warfighting capabilities. Now, on top of that, though, it can still do a lot of things. It still launches airstrikes and can target most places around the world, which is a show of strength. But what's interesting is that it's a show of strength that doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. Right? Airstrikes were used against Slobodan Milosevic in the 90s, and it wasn't until you had a color revolution that he finally got toppled. Airstrikes against the Houthis don't really amount to much. Even the touted airstrikes against Iran last year only really retrenched Iranian political interests. So I would argue that, yeah, it's a real capability and it's powerful, but by itself, it's more of an illusion, more of a hand-waving gesture to get you to not notice that the U.S. can't mobilize 150,000 men and invade Iraq. Like in 2003, the U.S. could do that. Most people, I think, would agree it can't do that now. But of course, that doesn't mean it's, quote, toothless. It can still do a lot of damage in other ways. And so my initial take is middle of the road. It has degraded significantly in the last 23 years. But it's not completely toothless. And then the question is, what can it actually still do, right? That's the question. And we'll hand it off to you now, Florian.
Yeah, thanks very much. There's several things I would like to add. That very good point that U.S. can't kick down doors anymore and mobilize on a massive scale. I mean, they probably would if they could, but they can't really right now. The U.S. has also lost soft power for no real gains by confiscating Russian oligarch money. They started that under Biden, which was really foolish because that's further weakened the US dollar, right? If you don't have a way to park your money in a secure currency, then okay, then you next time you go somewhere else. And I'm a little frustrated, you can say, talking to some people, especially from Europe, that are against Russia and that will say, "Oh, we all need to just switch to wartime economy, and then we're gonna kick their ass." Yeah, okay, switch Europe to wartime economy. That's going to devastate Europe to no end, right? For example, Germany has an export economy, and you can't switch it to a wartime economy. That means producing tanks, producing military equipment all the time for yourself, and you don't sell anything of that. So, and that's just one example of how kind of careless the narrative has become among Western forces, right? They just say, "Oh, we can somehow do it," and I think there the Western world falls into the trap of believing their own image, right? Yeah, we did some airstrikes here and there, and that's it. But as you rightly said, there needed to be a color revolution to depose Milosevic. The airstrikes really didn't do that, and they may even entrench opposition, right? It's there's has always been a great debate of whether the American and UK-led bombardments of civilian infrastructure in World War II were justified, and you can say, okay, that's basically to really devastate the opponent, but there's enough people that ask, is that really necessary, right? If your house gets bombed, you're not getting more sympathetic towards your enemies. It's just a blatant show of force that you can use to end a war, like the US did in Japan, but with the nuclear bombs. But it's not really a good measure, I think, to just depose a tyrant or something like that if you don't already hold all the strategic positions. It's like airstrikes can be a movement to finish someone off. Otherwise, you have to somehow follow that up with a longer term strategy, right? So I would agree with you. The U.S. military is degraded narrative wise, but it's still a pretty strong military, right? And the initial idea I had for suggesting this topic was that in the last week in December, the Department of War proposed a new class of military navy power with battleships, basically. And and people scoffed about it and laughed about that, but it's not really laughable because that battleship looks cool as hell, and that gets people sympathetic towards the military again, right? There's you can be heroes again. It has a narrative function for the own population. But also, what the U.S. does right now, they have destroyers of the Arleigh Burke class, and they can deal with drone attacks and stuff like that. Like an aircraft carrier cannot really deal with drone attacks. I mean, airstrikes won't really eliminate the drone threat, and then it's just a big fat target for drones, right? Aircraft carrier is not made for defensive weapons against drones. And so basically you use destroyers for that, and you use it in strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. That's what most people probably comes to mind, but there's another the Strait of Hormuz is basically guarding the entrance to the Persian Gulf between Saudi Arabia and Iran. For if you're viewing it, this is Saudi Arabia in the west and Iran in the east. But then there's also another entry. That's the Al Shabaab. I forgot the name. Bab el Mandab. That's flanked by Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen, and that guards that's basically the entry gate to the Red Sea. And that's also where Yemen, significantly made international trade flow significantly more expensive, and made things a little bit more difficult for the U.S. as well, right? For situations like that, where you have asymmetric strategies or tactics, you will need something like an Arleigh Burke class destroyer or other such military vessels that provide an easy way to push back against drones. The destroyers have one problem, though. They cannot operate forever. They have to be refueled, and they don't have as much space on deck. So if you have a battleship instead, then you have more space on deck, and they are nuclear driven. So you don't need to really refuel them for decades, probably, right? So for that reason, I think that was one way of getting the compromise solution that Todd just suggested. You should take some money for your suggestions. But yeah, that would be one example.
Right. So when talking about this, we also need to break down that there's essentially two pillars to the U.S. military strength. One is personnel, so people, human capital, and then the physical capital, the weapon systems, the ships, the airplanes. Okay, so what we see very clearly now is the depletion of the first one, because it's very difficult to envision now that the United States could raise an army of 150,000 men and then invade a country halfway around the world like it did Iraq in 2003. Partly that's because, the U.S. fell into the trap laid by Al-Qaeda, the grand strategy of bogging them down the Middle East. Partly it's due to the United States suffering with what the rest of the world's suffering, a demographic crisis. So there's just fewer people to recruit. On top of that, the military has been struggling to recruit people in general, with the usual methods of attracting new volunteers. They're not as successful as they once were. So there's a lot of compounding reasons why there's less human capital to go around. You could also argue that there's just junk human capital inherited from the Biden administration, a lot of political appointees, which I believe Trump and Hegseth are trying to remove, but of course that's going to take time. That's the first thing that goes down. Now, what can they still do? Most of the power projection of the U.S., even in 2003, was the result of its material resources, its ships, its airplanes, its logistics, all of that stuff. That's all still in place, mostly, though I don't think the ground forces are quite as large as they once were. The problem is all of this stuff is extremely old. It's aging. Some of these B-52s have been around for like 60 years. We're not there yet because they keep, using duct tape and bubble gum to keep these things going. But eventually there will be a point where these airplanes and Humvees and ships are just too old and they won't be able to be used anymore. And when that is, we don't exactly know, but everybody knows we're getting close. That's going to be the next shortfall in U.S. military projection. And the problem is the United States just doesn't have the capacity to reproduce these hard military assets. So let's look at shipping, right? Shipping is a joke. U.S. civilian shipping, as far as the three major producers of ships worldwide, commercial and military, it's China, South Korea, and Japan. And the United States can hardly produce civilian ships. Now, the government still owns ports directly and can build some surface vessels. The problem is the Navy procurement's a mess. You have the 25-year white elephant, the Zimwalt destroyer, which is still whatever that is. You've got the Constellation that was canceled this year, which is supposed to be a copy of a French-Italian design. And then you have there's so many false attempts. There was the Sea Shadow that was supposed to be a low observable ship that could just sort of like ghost around stealth mode. That didn't happen. It was based on a catamaran hull design. And then you were supposed to have littoral combat vessels. That never happened. There was a massive procurement problem for ships in the United States. And the replacements for like the Ticonderoga and other cruisers, destroyers, just aren't happening. Whereas China's just churning out ships like crazy. They now have 4 aircraft carriers compared to like 10 years ago when they had none. That's, crazy, right? So China's able to produce large amounts of ships from its ports. Now, of course, so can South Korea and Japan, but that creates problems for the U.S. Are we going to buy ships produced from allied countries? And even if that's the case, if a broader conflict breaks out in the Pacific, China's going to be targeting those ports, those docks, and you take them out and they're going to be down for how long? Years? There's a really serious production bottleneck for the United States' ability to build new ships. China doesn't have that. So this is going to be a really serious bottleneck for the material capital that the U.S. military needs in order to fight these wars. Now, that's an extreme case, but we have similar problems with aircraft They're all old. I mean, new ones need to be procured, and given the length of time it took for the F-35 to be procured, and then whatever the status quo for the B-21 Raider is, okay, those are really high performing aircraft, but you can't have a lot of them. You can't field a lot of them, and you still have to back up with more conventional aircraft unless you can just mass produce. See, I think what the U.S. is going to be doing in the future is they're going to have piloted aircraft that are, quote, stealth, low observable, and then they're going to pad that out with drones, with the idea of the loyal wingman, where they're basically, that would be your conventional expendable aircraft. Now, of course, you'd have to vastly ramp up production, and the drones that we do have that are unmanned aren't going to have the capability of, say, an F-16 fighting Falcon. Not yet. Maybe one day, but they don't yet. So there's going to be some bottlenecks there as well for producing aircraft to be flown for the U.S. Air Force. And then the military, the Army's been having problems. There was supposed to be this medium tank, the Booker, which also got canceled. Yeah, a lot of the U.S. military just cancels what it starts investing in, which China doesn't do that. They kind of do the opposite. They see it to the conclusion and then keep going. So the current, let's call it reduction in U.S. capabilities is in large part due to these human capital points, human capital exhaustion points. You just can't recruit 150,000 people and send them over to Iraq again, or Iran, which is what they seem to be trying to do. Now, the next phase of this degradation, I predict, will really become visible when all of these vintage heritage systems start breaking down and the U.S. just can't replace them. That's the real problem. In fact, we're seeing this in NATO as a whole, because they gave so much of their surplus to Ukraine over the last 4 years to fight Russia. And they're like, wow, what do we have left? Not a whole lot. And so, that shoe is going to fall whenever we reach that critical mass where all these heritage systems just don't work anymore. When that is, I don't know. But that's going to be phase 2. Florian.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks for the reminder about the resource report in the Ukraine war. It boggles the mind, and still does, and did from the very beginning. It was a huge. I mean, Russia had a huge advantage on the battlefield, and I didn't believe for a second these reports that, oh, Putin, he will fold, the Russian military is old and all that kind of stuff. Russia is a huge country, has like unlimited space to the east. It can easily recruit more people. It can easily switch at least partially to a wartime economy. It just has more material. Who cares if the material is old and rusty? If they have so much more, then it's just a waste of resources and the waste of people, sadly, then, of course, right? And so we just wasted money there instead of coming to a conclusion with the Ukraine war that now seems to be there anyway, right? So like the eastern Ukraine goes to Russia, the western Ukraine stays with Europe. That's basically it. We could have had that already in 2022, 2023. But no, we have to be victorious over Russia, whatever. But that's a problem, because you have people that are not serious in all these bureaucratic positions in the military, and that's a human capital problem, because they have no connection to what's happening on the ground. So if you have lots of bureaucrats, they will basically, earmark funds, and goes up to management and general staff, and they basically pour money into a conflict that can't be won. That's because there's a huge bureaucracy behind it that has lost connection to the ground, right? So this is the hidden cost of a too much bloated military, right? And also think about who did the airstrikes and all the quick snatch and grab operations that you could think about in Iran or certainly in Venezuela. That was Delta Force. Those are special forces, right? Where it goes on. We say great that Venezuela, didn't have a ground invasion, but that covers up the fact that we don't have enough soldiers for a ground invasion anyway, right? So how good that we did it that way, right? But then equipment old. The equipment is old and outdated, and that's a problem I remember from my days in biomedical science, especially in hospitals. You have old equipment, and this equipment is used for decades. You buy a microscope, you use that microscope for decades. Now, the problem is that now these things have no protection, cybersecurity. Yeah, if you the only reason that like a pacemaker or that a heart monitor isn't regularly attacked by terrorists is that those devices are so old you don't get at it, right? Neither hostile cybersecurity forces nor protective. But it's a problem if you have firmware that's too old and can easily be overpowered by smart hackers. They don't even need to be that smart. It's just old technology. If they hooked up to the internet or to an intranet, whatever, they are very easy to be captured. And that's a problem for military hardware probably as well, if it's too old. And, then we have the question of China that churns out ships like crazy. I would add to that they are very pragmatic as well. They put several weapon systems on freighters, right? So a normal freighter having cargo on it, and all of a sudden, oh, what do you know? There's a radar detector on there. Oh, and then there's some drones on there, right? And China has enormous amount of those freighters. The US has about like 4. You shouldn't believe it, but it's true. Okay, maybe it's false, but I read it on Twitter from a reliable source. We don't have that many as China has. China churns out more. They're more pragmatic also. And once again, because of the bloated bureaucracy, I surmise it's the US moves more slowly in that direction, right? I think probably having F-16 fighter jets, we can keep them for a longer while. They're like motorcycles in the air, right? So they're very versatile. You can do a lot of things with it. But that's also like this is an old technology, right? They may still be useful, but many other technology is not. One thing that is also becoming important in the future is, I think, like a robot fighting force, right? So if you see Tesla developing these humanoid robots, of course, next step is using them in war also, right? And in a way, I would like to put and like maybe a little bit of an additional thought here, a philosophical thought. Maybe it is kind of good that nobody in the world has now really a dope new way of weaponry. It seems like everyone is sort of like looking at old systems, and it's only China that's ramping up production. But there's not a real new category of weapons. Like in the 19th century, industrial style warfare started, and that was a huge disaster. So that was a new kind of warfare that they had, and they used it in Crimea first, and then a little bit also in the US Civil War, and later on First World War, of course, and that was a huge disaster. And maybe fate is kind of merciful to us right now that we don't have a huge new weapon system right now. But you could easily think that 20, 30 years down the line, AI will do wars for us, and that may have its own problems.
Yeah. So the other way to judge or gauge the actual capacity for the U.S. military to do things is how the U.S. behaves diplomatically, right? So let's compare George W. Bush in 2001 to 5 to Donald Trump now. Bush was very high-handed, issued ultimatums, sent in troops, airstrikes, did everything. I mean, it wasn't just a show; it was the real thing, right? It was really shocking on, not just some raid in Caracas, right? And so other world powers, the U.S. took a much stronger stance against. The fact that Trump's, whether it's in Iran or Israel or Venezuela or China, the stances he takes and the positioning of the U.S. armed forces are much more conservative than they were under George W. Bush, which is a recognition that the United States has, one, less power projection capability than it used to, and two, that, especially in East Asia, and of course Eastern Europe with Russia, its opponents have increased their strength as well, right? So it's a parity is approaching. Okay, so the point is the United States' capacity to project power is going down, and at least with Russia and China, specifically China, it's going up. So there's this parity that is being reached. Now the question is, do current trends hold? Does China keep growing? Does the U.S. keep falling? That depends on a variety of factors that haven't actually happened yet. But the point that I'm getting at is we know that the U.S. military is just less effective than it was 20 years ago because there's options that are just off the table. You just can't use them anymore. But you could have used them 20 years ago. So, and we've talked about some of the reasons why that's the case. Personnel degradation from long deployments in the Middle East, the degradation of the material side, the weapon systems, they get degraded. And then the other thing we haven't talked about is the ability to produce large amounts of munitions, which you mentioned industrial warfare, Florian. That is key. And of course, the Ukraine war has shown us that Russia can keep up with what we call dumb projectiles, as well as drones, which are, smart. You can guide them right. And then they have their own set of smart missiles, glide bombs and all that stuff. So they're able to produce these at the level necessary to wage a modern war, right? And the thing is, Europe and America struggled to supply Ukraine and Israel with 155 millimeter ammunition for their artillery shells. And these are dumb rounds. They're not smart weapons. They're just dumb rounds. And that's just not something the United States struggled with, in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. It just was not something they struggled with. The fact that it is now, and you compound that with the shipping problem, there's a bottleneck at the source, right? Industrial warfare needs manufacturing and production. And, well, that's not really where it used to be during, say, the Reagan buildup, right? Because a lot of the military hardware we're using is the result of the Reagan military buildup. And then what was left after the Cold War downsized a lot of it. And, yeah, it was quality stuff, but it's old now, right? And you can't keep using it over and over and over again without replacing it. And the United States still hasn't really figured out how to replace it. China has. China can replace ships that get sunk. They can just build more, right? I mean, China knows how to replace these things. Russia knows how to replace munitions and destroyed tanks and artillery. The West is struggling with that. And so I think the stress against human capital, the stress against material capital, and the stress against production of both munitions and vehicles are going to seriously impair the U.S.'s fighting capacity. And as long as these trends continue, I don't really see them being reversed anytime soon. We can expect the capacity of the U.S. military to project power to decline even further. Florian.
Yeah, if military parity is approaching, then would we see more proxy wars in the buffer zones between the powers? And second would be my question: why is it difficult to produce more ammunition? I give the word back to you.
Yeah, sure. So the first one, yeah, absolutely. We're going to see a lot more proxy wars because for the declining superpower, the U.S., They're low risk, low effort ways to look like you're doing something. And so they're going to be the U.S. will be more inclined to do that because they won't risk losing face as much, right? The U.S. just walked away from losing in Afghanistan and acted like nothing happened, and most of the population went along with it. But let's say you lose an aircraft carrier to China. Well, that's a lot harder to walk away from. But then for the rising power that has not yet reached parity, they're also going to favor this kind of warfare because they're going to be thinking, well, hey, look, it's not quite time to roll the dice yet. We're not there yet. We haven't reached parity. So in this upward, downward, movement, both sides are going to think that that's going to be a better way to go because it's just less risky. Now, of course, if this trend continues and then it's not, the parity is reached and then exceeded by, say, China, they're going to be felt more emboldened to actually take some direct action. Now, the reason why the West is having a hard time, there's two problems. Let's just stick to the U.S. Procurement's a mess. So I've been watching a bunch of videos on the Navy and problems the Navy has procuring ships. One of the big bottlenecks is everything is paper bureaucracy. So as long as somebody gives the Navy and the heads up, the right paperwork, nobody asks questions until it's too late, because nobody actually thought to go to the dock to see what was going to happen. So, for example, the Constellation was supposed to be 85% compatible with the Fren, which was the Franco-Italian frigate. By the time it was canceled, it had only 15% compatibility. And one of the reasons why nobody really noticed this was because they were just, playing the bureaucracy paperwork game. And so everybody's like, well, it all checks out. I'm not going to go to the port or the dock and see what's going on. That's a really big problem. And we see that with all levels of procurement of either new weapon systems or just producing more of the same that are brand new, right? The other problem we have is the deindustrialization of the West due to globalism, specifically the United States. How is China able to build all these things? Well, in large part because the United States gave China the factories, which was really stupid. I mean, I remember when I was in college and this was happening, I'm like, guys, China's just going to patiently bide its time and acquire all these factories and then develop their own factories. And then they're just going to, shut the gate on your hand and then, start throwing you around, because now they're the ones that make everything. And again, what made America the world superpower? It was the world's leading manufacturer. And that began, we first saw that in World War One. And then, the United States, in a bout of madness, gave away its winning hand to China for, 30 pieces of silver, some shekels, right? They didn't think about a future conflict with China. And the broader hollowing out of the Rust Belt, because, all that manufacturing, all that production just left because it was cheaper to have it produced in Indonesia or China or India or, Vietnam, right? And so the race to the bottom has sort of destroyed the ability of the U.S. to produce these things. And then the third thing that gets involved here is at the end of the Cold War, there was something like between 20 and 30 different arms contractors for the U.S. government. And then, of course, the war was over. The Cold War was over, so it all gets consolidated to something like 5 or 6. What that means, though, is a net reduction in productive capabilities. Because here's the thing, right? Once you start consolidating, the core companies that have all of these factories and manufacturing locations aren't going to be needing all of them. So they're just going to start closing them down. Now, on the one hand, that's efficient from a business point of view. But what it does is it hampers a nation's ability to produce such weapons when it needs to in a war. Because, right, the logic is different. If you have multiple competing firms, they're not all going to close down because they want to stay in business and get government contracts. Once you amalgamate and consolidate, well, then they're like, well, that's just too much on the balance sheet. I can't keep all that running. We don't have orders for that. So they're going to close it, right? And so for those three reasons, the United States is struggling to procure all these things.
I see. Yeah, that explains it. Also, I think it's a general switch of mindset that you see it in many companies, like Best Buy, for example, or other electronics companies. They will basically sell you, in retail very often, they will sell you things, but what they really make money from is the credit, right? So you want to have the computer now, okay, you can pay either $5,000, which you don't have, or just $150 per month, and it could be yours. You pay for the next 60 months, 5 years, but you can walk out with the computer right now, and we pay 30% APR on it. Maybe not as much, but you get the gist. So that is what most companies nowadays making money off, or maybe that has subsided a bit, but it was, especially during the COVID time, when basically manufacturing was also slowed down. I would add that to the problem with manufacturing, that a lot of the supply chains have been revamped or are gone, basically. I play tennis myself, quick story, and the modern tennis balls, they are different from the tennis balls we had in 2019, 2020. Those balls were, and tennis balls are important, are kind of an indicator of manufacturing and supply chains, because there was a huge shortage of tennis balls in 2021. Thanks to COVID, right? So it really depends on, this is a manufacturing article that really depends on functioning supply chains. And the balls you get now are not that they fluff up quickly after you play a little, like 10 minutes with them. It didn't used to be that way in the past. So I would say in many other cases, supply chains have been destroyed and need to be rebuilt. And, I mean, if you, never change a working system, if you do change it, you never get it back as nicely as it was before, right? So that's also one problem. I would say I had an idea that if you have, especially as Todd said, you basically, as parity is slowly being reached, smaller countries will also engage, and upcoming powers will also try to engage. And I thought about that maybe you'll have, maybe military manufacturing is like any other startup. It starts with an exciting new idea, and then, they buy more of it. People buy into it. You have an early majority of people that buy. You have a late majority, and then at one point the company becomes like commoditized. And I imagine that especially while global powers revamp, especially the Asian powers revamp their productivity, you will see new startups that are coming up that have totally new ideas of weapon systems. That may be something new and impactful. And then I also realized that surveillance technology also is probably a big part of future warfare, because you already have all these surveillance companies now. You have countries that do unbridled surveillance on their citizens, not just China, the UK also, and also the vamping up in militarization. I like that ICE has more people coming up. I like that, but it also means that you have more of a militarization of police. And that also feeds into the military, right? If you have militarization of police, then you also basically probably try out some of your military technology on civilian infrastructure. So surveillance is a big part of that, and that will actually play a bigger role. I think some people also mentioned that that you had military surveillance that told you that those boats that they attacked in the I think Atlantic Ocean from Venezuela, or Pacific Ocean. That one of the oceans, like we are bombing drug boats for a while, right? And they knew that there were drug boats because they had surveillance technology that followed the drugs from Venezuela to the ports to the boats. That's certainly there, and that will also play a big role in future military technology. Realizing what the opponent does, like just immediately after it does it, right? So that could be another kind of Cold War-like situation where both sides try to up themselves with surveillance equipment.
Yeah, the most important reason why the United States military is degraded and declining, and why China, among other the major peer nation, is reaching parity, is that there's a fundamental. This has nothing to do with the material aspects of war, but the mental. It's strategy. It's the mindset. So there's a saying that amateurs study tactics and professionals study logistics. The thing is, strategy trumps logistics, because if you look at Vietnam and Afghanistan, who had a better logistical network, them or the U.S.? Well, clearly the U.S., but the U.S. lost. Why? Because the U.S. didn't understand strategy. They didn't understand the war they were fighting. The North Vietnamese and the Taliban did, and so they won. Now, that's at the level of strategy. You're not fighting the war you're really fighting. Now, that's one problem. Well, the other problem is the United States just doesn't remember the principles that made it powerful in the first place. So for example, the primacy of sea power, Alfred Thermahan's influence of sea power on history, or the geopolitical ruminations of people like Mackinder, Spikeman, and Kennan, who laid the foundation for Anglo-American hegemony worldwide based on an understanding of how the world works, based on geography and international trade and sea power. Now, all of that was rooted in, objective, historical conditions, material conditions. Now we live in this fantasy land where we can make our own future. It's what the Bush administration said in the early 2000s. And so the very core of policy making, of decision making, that made the Anglo-American establishment so powerful, so hegemonic, is completely rotted out from within. nobody really remembers any of this. They may pay lip service to it, but they really don't act like they understand it. And furthermore, they're not creating the conditions under which these mindsets, strategic insights, and doctrines of conduct can be preserved over time. And so we've seen, since Korea, the warning of MacArthur, there's no substitute for victory. And yeah, the U.S. has been struggling to win wars ever since the U.S. fired MacArthur. It seems to be interesting, doesn't it? But the point is, war fighting capability is ultimately rooted on a sense of strategic insight and thought, as well as an understanding of the environment you're acting in. So again, Mahan with sea power and trade, and Mackinder with geography. All of that works together. And then the United States is just not remembering those lessons, because ultimately the two, as I mentioned in Tuesday's show, the two major rivals to the Anglo-American establishment, Germany and the Soviet Union in the 20th century, were hard power-oriented empires. And that's really easy to point the finger at and say, well, you're the bad guy because you're dropping bombs on people, or you're the bad guy because you're throwing them in jail, or you're the bad guy because you're stomping on their face with a boot. Well, since 2003, what has the U.S. been doing? Since 2001. All of the things that the former opponents of the Anglo-American establishment did, and then they lost worldwide support. And the U.S. is, doing exactly the same thing. And that's another thing that's degrading the U.S. military's capacity to fight, the moral high ground that it used to have, right? So in 2001, everybody was like, oh man, 9/11 is a horrible atrocity. Putin even called George W. Bush, right? And most of the world still had a positive view of the United States and the U.S. military because of what it had done during the Cold War. And as you said, Florian, earlier tonight, most of that soft power was burned up for no appreciable gain. And so the moral high ground that the United States military used to rely on, because ultimately that means people aren't going to then start fighting you. They're like, oh, no, you're the good guy here. I'm going to work with you, or I'm going to stay neutral, right? And so if you look at the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan, the non-aligned world turned against them. They got isolated completely by that invasion. And then the United States was able to diplomatically isolate them, contain them, bleed them out in Afghanistan, and then, launch a series of color revolutions to topple the Soviet Union. Now, all of that was taking place from a very different mindset, a very different way of doing things. And all of those lessons have just been tossed out the window, which I think is the most fatal injury to the performance of the U.S. military.
Yeah, that's true, and it fits into, and I think logistics really is the unsung hero of so many areas. Even dating. You imagine you find a girl or whatever partner you want, and you hit it off, right? It's really good, but then it turns out you live 1 hour away from the meeting point. That makes it all more difficult to continue the date, right? So logistics is everything, and there's other examples. For politics, whoever controls state politics will be able to have checkpoints to determine voting outcomes, right? That's something I realized in 2011 when was one of the one of the midterms that was won by the Republicans. I think 2010 actually, and they won several governors' mansions, and now they could basically determine the gerrymandering and also other things that made voting more favorable more favorable to them, right? So nobody really pays attention to state elections, but they are really important because they determine how easy it will be for your opponent to win elections in your state, right? So that's one thing, and the party that controls Congress, right? The party that controls the House, even if one party controls the House with 2 seats majority, a razor-thin margin, they will have the leadership of all the committees. That means they get to decide which topics will even be debated. So some topics that would be important for your political opponent to have a narrative increase, they have kind of like grab momentum, these topics, they won't even make it to the forefront, right? So you basically starve out your opponent of the political capital that he could build up otherwise. And in a way, you could also think about logistics when you look at the anti-ICE protests. It's kind of an asymmetric warfare. What happens, and I really thought about how come that these protesters always know where like beforehand, where there's the ICE rate going down. How come? Is there like a leaker inside ACE? Like, seems unlikely for all those raids. And then I realized what happens is you have some observers, and they watch out. If ICE vehicles show up in your city, they blow the whistle, and then everyone else knows. It's basically signal fire. So that's part of asymmetric warfare, right? It's not really war because it's against police and law enforcement, but it's the same tactic, right? So that's also like a very asymmetric in logistics. That's very easy, very, very difficult to really curb. I mean, it's almost impossible. You can't stop people from blowing a whistle once they see your cars, right? You could do raids in the middle of the night, but that's also less efficient than doing it in broad daylight. So there's always small things. If you lose the narrative and people don't think you're a good guy, they will come up with logistics that serves their purpose and is very, very quick and flexible and agile, basically, right? It's very simple. A whistle doesn't cost anything, and everyone can have a whistle and just alert other people, right? And that's an example how narrative control is really important, because otherwise you have more people supporting that, and logistics can be built up very quickly, at least for like some, if you want to engage in asymmetric warfare.
Yeah. The other thing too is, if we look at the last, say, 40 years of the U.S. military being used, it really hasn't engaged in a large-scale conventional war with a peer power. So the Persian Gulf War doesn't really count because Iraq was already exhausted by 10 years of war with Iran. I mean, basically, at the end of that war in 87, Saddam had to basically re-kit his entire military because most of it had been destroyed fighting Iran. And, of course, the United States had a quantum leap in stealth and precision guidance technology, which helped out a lot. And then, of course, the war on terror is not against peer adversaries. They're insurgents, right? Even in Vietnam, it was against primarily insurgents. The last time the United States military engaged in a peer battle was in Korea. And the Chinese did pretty well, considering they were well behind the 8 ball with regards to technology. They just gained their, united themselves after a century of humiliation. And they fought the U.S. to a standstill. The U.S. General who was present at the armistice, General Ridgway, who'd fought in Italy in World War II, did not consider this a victory. He said the United States has never done this before. We have won outright, right? An armistice is just a cessation of hostilities. And so there is a real question, how effective, in a large-scale conventional conflict would the U.S. military be? We don't know, because most of the deployments have been against insurgent forces, or in the case of Iraq in the early 90s, a special target that had already been exhausted by fighting its own war, right? And so, or beating up on Latin American countries. So the other thing too is there's this projection of power, but it's not been tested, right? The last time anything like a large-scale conventional conflict against a peer power, which is what people are fearing in the coming years, was Korea. And, the U.S.'s performance was mixed in Korea compared to earlier conflicts. And so there's a lot of reasons to be, to question, how effective. Now, of course, this is all after the GWOT, after, 4 years of Ukraine. And I think things are getting even more dire in that situation. And now, of course, in the United States, in the West, most people don't see it that way. Most people just believe what they're told, especially those people in the military, because, you don't want to wake up every morning and say, oh, I'm in an institution that's crumbling and that, I'm probably going to, die overseas. You're right. Nobody says that, right? When the British Empire fell apart in the 40s, they weren't telling themselves that, even though it was true. Right, when the Soviet Union fell apart in the early 90s, again, nobody was saying that out loud, but it was true. And I feel like that, with the British and Soviet empires collapsing, there are similar trends that we're observing now with the U.S. military.
Yeah. I would basically, as like a synthesis of that, I would basically say that you can probably get people relatively quickly on your side if they think that the case is righteous, and if they believe your narrative, and so you can mobilize people with like very simple devices. Doesn't mean if you have less power in terms of military that you can't be effective. You know, asymmetric warfare is always easy to do, and I think, yeah, I think what we learned from all this is that I think I'm more optimistic now about the future of the U.S. in terms of warfare, as I was in the past under Joe Biden. I think if the Republicans can keep that up and push forward, then there's a narrative win for the U.S. and they will be able to maybe stay a little bit ahead of the parity, don't think behind China, right? It's also, but there could definitely be like a future Cold War between China and the U.S. because even if you are just 2% better than your opponent, you don't attack your opponent, right? You basically wait until you're really better. And something about China that I haven't conclusively understood. You hear conflicting reports. Some say China is very capable of producing new stuff, and they're not kept back by any regulation and so they can really produce new stuff. And look at these shiny new cities. And then the next report you get is that those are just Potemkin's villages, right? So you're quite not sure whether China is just posing, or whether China is really, whether we should take China seriously, or whether they just talk a big game.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, I'll just summarize my position. So right now, the United States is a military, I would argue, is in this middle position. It's fallen from its hyperpower status in 2001, where it could pretty much do whatever it wanted and just knock down the doors of most countries. I mean, not Russia and China, but everybody else, basically. And now it's on a downward slope, and I don't see that downward slope reversing. And what are the reasons? Well, the fatigue of the personnel. There just isn't the same level of human capital that there was in the past. The degradation of the material resources of war, the old platforms, the heritage platforms that are just need to be replaced, and the government's and then following that up, the inability for the U.S. government to procure things on a regular basis or an efficient basis to replace these aging systems, and then fourthly, the skill gap and strategy and just focusing on what made America strong in the first place. All of those basic principles are gone. Deindustrialization means it's very difficult for the U.S. to build all these things in-house anymore. With distributed supply chains, I mean, if China does anything with Taiwan, all your computer products go way up because, that's where the microchips come from. And so it was smart for Taiwan, but dumb for the U.S. because it just makes the U.S. vulnerable to at a point where it didn't need to be vulnerable. And so all of these, I think, come together to create a picture that the United States is not what it was militarily, probably significantly less than what we're telling ourselves. How much so, it's hard to tell because, of course, that kind of information is carefully guarded. And probably the information you'd need to gather to create such a picture, nobody would fund that research project because why would you? It's bad for the point of view of these people. So there's an incentive for the U.S. military to be a blowfish, to look bigger than it is, and to have these flashy, eye-catching operations that draw attention away from its inability to do other things. And if you watch a lot of like I said, I've watched a lot of videos about people talking about the Navy. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff that if you know where to look, it's looking pretty bad, but people aren't really talking about it except in these back channels, right? And so for all these reasons, I think that, again, it's not a mirage, but it's becoming significantly degraded. And that degrading process, I don't see being reversed. Final thoughts, Florian?
Yeah, I would end on a slightly more optimistic note than what I said before. I also would like to mention that Rainlord 137 said that China is also planning a missile battleship, so it's not that bad an idea. But US need to get the hypersonic missiles in order. Also, the deck gun of warships are very effective flag gun versus drones. Yeah, that's a good point. And it's nice to know that China also does it, so it's not a far out idea. Um, and then yeah, businesses. And then somebody said about, sorry, I don't find you anymore. Who said this? I think Sunny Jim 1355 said that cash used to be king. Now it's not wanted as much as a payment plan is. Yeah, that's true. And I heard people when they go to a car dealership and want to pay in cash, they're not really. That's not what they really want, because they want to lease you a car, and then they make 20% interest on that. And so on the talk about military strength and bureaucracy, maybe transfer to that. There's a lot of people that are profiting from a military that is just a bloated bureaucracy, right? So there's basically managerialism has created situations and institutions in the West which are basically just managing problems. Pharmaceutical industry wants you to manage your problem, not cure you. Homeless shelter management, they want to manage it. They don't want to cure homelessness. And the military is one of that as well, right? They want to keep the status quo. They don't want to end wars. They want to keep them low key going on. That's because that's what makes secure profits on the long term. Yeah. So I think that's the thing. And the slightly more positive note is that you have these American entrepreneurs again. Elon Musk is one of these people that basically are single-handedly having like several companies. You also have someone like Palmer Luckey, who invented one of the first virtual reality glasses, and he did that by tinkering in his garage. I read a story, and he has now the company Anduril, which is one of the startups, and they are basically producing drones and military hardware, surveillance, and all the kind of stuff. So you still have these. Maybe there's an overall fatigue in terms of personal, but in bloatedness. But you also have American-style entrepreneurs starting in their garage, tinkering around, and if we have more people like that, then the military will come back to what it was in the past. So that would be my more optimistic outlook.
All right. Well, thank you again, Florian. It's always a pleasure having you on.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.